everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone. Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone back for another pair of excellent keynote addresses. Dr. James Hansen. All right, everybody. Could we please take a seat? We're trying to get this thing started. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you back for another round of wonderful keynote addresses. Dr. James Hansen and Professor Mary Wood are both eminent scholars in their field, and their voice is very important to the environmental movement. First off, however, I'd like to change our focus for a minute. I hope many of you were able to attend this afternoon's keynote, but if you weren't, I highly encourage you to watch them on our YouTube channel later. For me especially, the speech given by Demi Bibare and Johannes Dekme, representatives from the Mungme and Chamorro tribes of West Papua, was very powerful and truly made me realize the impact of this conference and what kind of impact it can have and should have. In fact, I'd like to take a moment and ask all international presenters and attendees to please stand up so we can give you a proper thank you. They all traveled a very great distance to be with us and share their stories, and I think we should be grateful for their contribution to the environmental movement as a whole, because these issues are far too often swept under the rug. So on that note, I'd like to talk for a minute about an organization with very close ties to the PIELC, and one I'm very happy to be externing for this semester. In fact, I like it so much, I'm going to show you a little bit about their work and give them a special thanks for their relationship to the PIELC. The PIELC gave birth to the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, or ELAW, in 1989. And every year, they bring amazing lawyers from countries all around the world to the PIELC. Public interest lawyers from 10 countries met at the PIELC and decided to create a new kind of organization. And it has now grown to be a network of lawyers in over 70 countries. They realized they could share strategies and legal and scientific information across borders. They could promote environmental protection more effectively. It would be a horizontal democratic network. ELAW helps grassroots environmental lawyers working in their home countries to protect environment and communities through the law, combating environmental abuses and enforcing the environmental laws. If needed, they help local lawyers create new organizations, for example, as they did in West Africa and Liberia. They also help local lawyers who teach citizens about their right to a healthy environment, so citizens can participate in decisions about their own environment. Their partner in Jamaica, for instance, produced this guide, It Inna de Law, or It's in the Law, in the local language. Some people devote their lives to helping others protect the planet and local communities, and some of them are here in this room tonight. Byrne Johnson, the executive director of ELAW, was the first staff attorney at ELAW before assuming his position of executive director in 1993. He directs the work of ELAW and develops initiatives to protect the environment through law and science. His work to protect the environment has taken him to the former Soviet Union, Asia, the Middle East, the South Pacific, Central and South America, and Africa, where he sometimes gets rid of his business suit. Lori Maddox, the associate director of ELAW, helped launch the ELAW network in 1991. She's traveled to Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to reach out to new advocates to help them build their organizations. Lori leads ELAW's network in Mexico and Central America. She also works with the Mesoamerican Legal Strategy Group to protect the Mesoamerican reef and coastal watersheds and build public interest environmental law in Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. Sometimes she even gets to see the reef in the forests. Mark Chennai, the staff scientist at ELAW, joined ELAW in 1992. He helps attorneys and citizens make effective use of scientific information to defend the environment. Mark's work has taken him to Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. And at home, his duties as a father include supporting his daughter, one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuits inspired by Professor Mary Wood. Mercedes, or Meche Liu, of the is the environmental research scientist at ELAW. She began her work in 1991 while in Peru, and she joined the US office in 2003. Her work has taken her to Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Australia, and Eastern Europe. Mesha provides an on-site support for air, water, and soil quality analysis and expert opinion on all environmental impact assessments and environmental health. And finally, Jennifer Gleason, a staff attorney at ELAW, joined ELAW in 1993. Her work with ELAW has taken her to the Caribbean, Central America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, and Africa, where she has helped bring together dozens of environmental lawyers. She manages ELAW's legal assistance program and collaborates with lawyers around the world to strengthen and enforce laws that protect the environment and human rights. So sometimes that work takes her far into the field. No solar-powered Land Rovers yet, eh, Jen? And also, Jen, I'd just like to say, now that the conference is coming to a close, I can finally get that memo that I owe you too, yeah. But wowza, that's a mouthful of accomplishment. And I can't remember, what was I why was I telling you guys about ELA? I'm not sure, there's a reason. Oh yeah, all right. Well, on behalf of the students of Land, Air, Water and the PIELC, I'm very happy to announce the recipients of the 2014 David Brower Lifetime Achievement Award. The ELA team of Bern Johnson, Lori Maddox, Mark Chernaic, Meshalou, and Jen Gleason. Please come on up. What a great team.
Thank you very much. On behalf of ELA, it's an honor to work with and for all you people who are so inspiring and so powerful. Thank you very much.
Next, we are proud to present the world premiere of the 10th film in the award-winning series, Stories of Trust, Calling for Climate Recovery. This series is co-produced by Eugene's Own, Our Children's Trust, and the international human rights organization, Witness. We are fortunate tonight to have with us everyone featured in the film and the talented filmmakers Christy Cooper-Coon and Kelly Matheson. We bring you A Climate of Trust. I'm not a Mac user, sorry.
In my mind, I can't even look a young person in the eye unless I know I am doing everything possible to secure their future.
One of the things that all governments must be accountable for is ensuring the health and the survival of future generations.
The youth understand and are bold enough to take the initiative and the leadership to say, we have laws in place that protect our future. Now, judiciary, interpret them and protect our rights.
I didn't want my grandchildren to say that Opa understood what was happening, but he didn't make it clear.
In 1981, I wrote a paper on climate change and said we cannot burn all of the fossil fuels, that we would create a completely different planet if we burned it all.
The impacts that I think are the most important are those which are irreversible on any time scales that humans would care about. The temperature has, of course, continued to go up, and each decade has been warmer than the one before.
As we get stronger greenhouse warming of the surface, that causes more heat waves and drought, but it also causes the atmosphere to hold more water vapor. We can see things happening now. For example, the fires. The 100-year flood is no longer occurring just once every 100 years. The Arctic sea ice is receding rapidly. Glaciers in mountains all around the world are melting. And we know from the Earth's history that with increasing greenhouse gases, we will get sea level rise of several meters. Coastal cities all around the world would be affected. We've continued down that pathway where we're developing every fossil fuel we can find, and the changes will be much bigger in coming decades. What drove me to change from doing pure science to speaking out about it was the fact that I had both children and grandchildren, and I decided I didn't want them to say that their grandfather
for us. They deserve their legacy just as I deserve my legacy. When Hurricane Katrina hit, it was so devastating that I began to read climate science, particularly James Hansen's work. It was very clear that this is the most urgent matter of our lifetime. And so that's when I began to start tailoring my legal work to climate crisis. The public trust doctrine is the oldest concept of environmental law, an obligation of government to protect the resources for present and future generations of citizens. It is completely geared towards protecting those societal needs that support human dignity, human comfort, and human survival. And so after Hurricane Katrina hit and climate crisis really came to the forefront, I thought, why aren't they focusing more on what the public trust means? People ask me what natural resources are protected under the public trust doctrine. There's the stream beds, the rivers, the wildlife, the tidelands. The reason those are protected is because they are so integral to society. And then here, just here's some beautiful, look how beautiful this stairs. I realized the public trust protects all natural resources that have a critical impact on society, and that certainly includes air and atmosphere. It is the linchpin resource that controls everything else, because it is absolutely key to human survival. If everybody can realize there's a legal duty of protection for the atmosphere that is property of present and future generations, then courts can enforce that.
When I spoke to Mary Wood, I had read some related things about the way our founding fathers looked at what amounted to the trust concept, because Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had exchanged letters in which they thought that the current generation then should preserve the fertility of the soils for the next generation. And that, they felt, was an obligation. And that's very similar to the idea that the present generation needs to preserve the climate for the next generation.
In order to stabilize the climate, we have to reduce the atmospheric carbon dioxide from the present amount to about 350 parts per million. Well, that's a tall order. It requires both reducing fossil fuel use, but also restoring some of the carbon to the biosphere and the soils that has been released over the last century or two. We have shown from climate studies that if we wait 10 years before we begin, then we would need to reduce emissions 15% a year, which is just implausible. That's why it is urgent that we begin to reduce the emissions soon, so that it's feasible to stabilize the climate.
My late grandfather taught me from a very early age to not just appreciate nature in terms of aesthetics, but also, its inherent value.
The atmosphere, without it, we wouldn't last literally for more than a few minutes, right? So we absolutely need the atmosphere to survive.
I was brought on board at the Goddard Institute to study the human dimensions of the global carbon cycle. I got involved with Jim because he was also focused not just on the problem side, but the solution side of the issue.
I and many other climate scientists believe that we're already in what we consider the dangerous zone, meaning that even if we keep things exactly as they are in terms of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, that will still lead to very damaging impacts on both human society and natural ecosystems down the road. There's still a good basis for optimism, but the window of time is shrinking. We need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions immediately, and by as much as we can.
Each year we wait, it becomes much, much harder to reduce CO2 emissions, for one thing, but secondly, it becomes far more costly, and economic studies have shown this time and time again.
The means are like what's missing is the will. Our government and most governments around the world are doing woefully little to actually show that they mean what they say when they say they want to make an impact in terms of reducing climate change and potential disastrous impacts in the future.
I remember when I really first started thinking about climate change came from my dad. My father was a tremendous inspiration to me growing up. He's been teaching for almost 50 years, and he's really one of the founders of environmental law. He was reading what the scientists were saying about climate change, and I remember him telling me, climate change is a game changer. This is going to be the biggest challenge that you will ever face. And I think all of the scientists, all of the attorneys would agree that it's probably the most complex problem that this world has ever faced. But it's not impossible. The best description of what I've seen as an attorney comes from my children books. What does your daddy and mommy do each day? A baker bakes bread, a fireman puts out fire, and a lawyer solves problems. And I really take that seriously. As an attorney, it's my obligation to make sure that we are taking action to solve this climate crisis. Hopefully I'm doing a good enough job to make sure that their voices are heard in the judicial system, because the judges need to hear this.
We stand to lose everything this country was built on: American security, the resources, and we stand to lose a lot of human life. That is why atmospheric trust litigation is so needed. On May 4th, 2011, there was a hatch of ATL petitions and lawsuits across every state in this country. And that's never been done in the history of law. One group of actions across every single state saying the same thing, all brought by youth plaintiffs, making the same demand on government. Youth are asserting that the atmosphere is shared in common by them and by future generations, and that the governments have the obligation to protect it.
It's about giving voice to these children who are going to be affected by climate change. Scientists have been working very hard, and they understand what is needed for us to have a healthy atmosphere. And we're asking that the court adopt what the scientists are recommending that we do. And that's that we cap our emissions in a particular year by a certain percentage so that we will get to the point where we have a healthy atmosphere. The scientists have raised the alarm, and they're telling us that the time is now for us to act.
It's not going to be convenient, but the science should not be based on what is convenient. We have to say what is actually necessary. If you look at our Congress, it is well-oiled and coal-fired. It's very difficult to get members of Congress to vote for what would be in the best interests of the public when they are so well paid by the fossil fuel industry. The Declaration of Independence and Constitution, the principle that all people are created equal.
The basis for civil rights actions is also relevant to young people. Young people are people, and they should have equal rights.
So it's great to bring in the judiciary, because they are the ones who are independent enough to force the other branches to actually take meaningful action that's in line with the best available science.
This public trust doctrine is a fundamental citizen right. If we were invaded by some foreign nation, the government would have the obligation to act. There would be a clear threat. And climate now is just as clear a threat to our children's future. Trust is a profound obligation. It is all that the youth have today. They have trust in government, and they have trust in their parents, and then they have trust in their communities. There will be a judge who will rule in favor of these youth plaintiffs, because that judge will realize the crucial window of time that we sit in. The only question in my mind is, will this be in time?
mic? All right, there we go. I'm going to let Nate figure out the Mac because I failed last time. The next speaker is the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies and is currently an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Earth Institute. In 2006, he was featured in Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people on the planet. 1 year before I was born, in 1988, Dr. James Hansen traveled to Capitol Hill to warn our leaders that the climate was changing. 26 years later, Dr. Hansen arrives tonight fresh on the heels of a high-profile climate change summit in China. While the climate has changed in the intervening years, Dr. Hansen's energetic pursuit of solutions has not. As a recent example of his dedication, several nights ago, Dr. Hansen pulled an all-nighter to write an op-ed for publication in China. In this piece, he says that he feels responsible for not adequately communicating the urgency of climate change to political leaders. Although he feels he has fallen short, accountability does not fall on him alone. As the public interest environmental law community, we have an obligation to pressure our political leaders with the same intensity that Dr. Hansen has. Let's not look back in 25 years with regrets. Let's mark this moment as one of renewed commitment to climate action. We are honored to host Dr. Hansen and Eugene this weekend, and without further ado, I invite you to welcome him to the stage.
Thanks very much. Yes, our objective is to avoid catastrophic human-made climate change, and that's not the right button to push. Let me escape and try this button. That's better. Okay, so the climate is getting warmer decade by decade. This is the last 5 decades, and then far right on the lower side is the last 3 years, the first 3 years of this decade. And you can see the red colors, each decade is getting warmer. Well, the last 3 years are about the same as the last decade, but that's because the Pacific Ocean goes through these oscillations, Pacific decadal oscillations, and the Pacific has been a little cool the last 3 years. But that doesn't mean that global warming is stopping. We know that very well. In fact, signature of this Pacific variability is that in the summer, when the zonal winds are weak, then that would not have much effect on the land temperatures. And as you can see with the red curves, the land temperatures are continuing to get warmer every year. But the winter temperatures, the blue curve, oscillate with this specific decadal oscillation, and we happen to be in the cool phase at the moment. But you can expect, by the way, that this year or next year will be the warmest year on the record because we're going to get an El Nino very soon and move, unfortunately, to warmer temperatures. And we know that each decade is going to be warmer because the planet is out of energy balance. There's more energy coming in from the sun than there is heat being radiated. And now we can measure that for the first time because most of that energy has to go into the ocean. The atmosphere is very thin and it has very small heat capacity. The ocean is very deep and it can hold a lot of heat. So what we have to do is measure the temperature in the ocean, and we now have more than 3,000 floats distributed around the oceans, and they dive down to 2 kilometers and measure, and then come back to the surface and radio the information to a satellite. And what we find is that the ocean is continuing to gain more and more heat. It tells us that the planet is substantially out of energy balance. It's less than a watt per square meter, but that's the equivalent of having that amount of energy is equal to that released by 400,000 atomic bombs, Hiroshima atomic bombs, every day, 365 days a year. So it's a fair amount of energy. And it's going to cause the planet to get warmer, and we can see this is going to continue. Now, the impacts, as I mentioned in that little film, are the ones that are most concerning are those that are irreversible. If ice sheets disintegrate, sea level goes up. It takes tens of thousands of years to build an ice sheet from snowfall piling up. So we don't want that to happen and get a large sea level rise. And likewise, if you exterminate the species, that's irreversible. The the things that people notice, though, are more the climate extremes. And as the planet gets warmer, we will get more heat waves in the summer and more extreme droughts and fire. And we see that these bell curves describe the distribution of temperature anomalies about the average. The top row is the summer, the northern hemisphere summer temperatures over land. And if you go back to the last century on the left, the bell curve was a nice symmetric bell curve because the anomalies are defined relative to the average temperature at that time, and so it's pretty symmetric. But what's happening, and this is real data, it's not models, what's happening is that as we go decade by decade, the last 3 decades, we see that the bell curve is shifting to the right. And so the extreme hot anomalies, those dark red ones, which occurred only a few tenths of a percent of the time, are now occurring about 10% of the time, or covering 10% of the land area in a typical summer. And those extreme events are the ones that we've witnessed the last few years. Summer before last, it was really, the whole Midwest was a 3 standard deviation anomaly, and the year before that it was Texas and Oklahoma, and the year before that Asia, Moscow, and Middle East. The winter, the anomalies are equally large, but they don't affect the bell curve as much because the bell curve is measured in terms of the standard deviation, the normal. Hotter, and so they're more damaging. And the area covered by them is increasing. And when the atmosphere is warm enough, when the atmosphere is warmer, there goes more water vapor. And that means that when it does rain, you get more extreme events, and you get more extreme floods. And also, as I mentioned in the film, the 100-year flood is occurring more often. And we're going to get some 500-year floods. I think they had one in Colorado. And the storms that are driven by water vapor, by the latent heat, the energy that water vapor sees, evaporates from the ocean surface, that provides the energy for certain kind of storms. When it condenses again, it releases that energy, and it drives thunderstorms, hurricanes, and tornadoes. And so the storms can be stronger if the planet gets warmer. Doesn't mean everyone is going to be stronger, but they have the potential to be stronger. And that particular example was Sandy coming up the East Coast, and the water was 3 degrees warmer than normal, so it stayed a hurricane force all the way to New York City. Now, with regard to how much warming we can tolerate, Earth's history is our best guide. If we look at the last time it was warmer than it is today, that was the Permian interglacial period 120,000 years ago. It was 2 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial, which now it's already warmed up in the last century by 0.8 degrees Celsius. So it's only about 1 degree warmer than what it is now. And sea level was 6 or 7 meters higher. You go back even further to warmer times, and the sea level is even higher. But if we get 6 meters, that's already 20 feet. So that would mean all coastal cities would be dysfunctional. So we don't want that to happen. But So the question is that, how long does it take for the ice sheets to melt? That's a question, because usually the scientific studies the UN does, they try to estimate what it's going to be like late this century. And they say, well, it may be about 1 meter. Well, if it is 1 meter at the end of the century, that would mean the next century is going to be several meters. So we don't even want that, but we don't know. In my opinion, if we follow business as usual, we could get to several meters during the lifetime of those people today. We look at the ice sheets, we see that the area that has melted in the summer is increasing as the planet gets warmer. And that water will go to a low spot on the ice sheet, and it just throws a hole in the ice sheet. It goes to the base of the ice sheet, where it lubricates the base of the ice sheet and increases the discharge of giant icebergs to the ocean. And of course, because the atmosphere is warmer, it snows more. So you might say, well, maybe the ice sheets are going to grow. Well, common sense would tell you if the planet gets warmer, the ice sheets are probably going to get smaller. And now we can measure that too, because we have a gravity satellite which measures the gravitational field of the Earth so precisely that we can measure changes in the mass of the ice sheets, which lose mass during the melting season and get heavier during the winter as the snow piles up. But overall, Greenland is now losing mass at more than 500 cubic kilometers per year net loss over the summer and winter. And Antarctica is also beginning to lose mass. And with this update, it's getting even a little faster on Greenland. And the question is, well, we want to avoid falling off that cliff. Sea level is now going up 3.2 millimeters a year, which is about 13 or 14 inches in a century. So it's not yet enormous, but if we keep getting warmer, it's going to get larger. Now the other irreversible thing that I focus on is extermination of species, which is euphemistically called reduction of biological diversity by scientists for some reason. But the problem is that we're causing stresses on species in many different ways. But if we add to those stresses the rapidly shifting climate zones, then we know that an enormous fraction of the species on the planet are in trouble. Because there were a few cases of large warming on the Earth, which did cause some mass extinctions. But those warmings were much slower than this one. They took thousands of years. While we're in a century or 2 centuries, we're causing, or threatening to cause, very large changes. So the shifting of zones would be much faster, which makes it much more difficult for many species to try to migrate, to stay within those zones, especially because we humans have sort of taken over a large part of the planet. So it's harder for other species to migrate in that case. And I like to use this monarch butterfly as an example species because we're putting stress on it with the Roundup, the pesticide that kills weeds. The farmers use it to kill weeds, including milkweeds, which is the only plant that the larvae, the caterpillars, the butterfly can eat. And so that's why in the film I started several years ago to plant milkweeds to try to help these butterflies with my grandchildren because I like to introduce them to the outdoors. And this is a remarkable species. It's just an insect. This insect migrates from central Canada to central Mexico and somehow knows how to get back to this small mountainous area where it hibernates for the winter. And it does this not the single butterfly, but over 3 or 4 generations, it can make that round trip cycle. But when my wife and I were younger, we could see 10 or 12 of these butterflies at the same time. Now we're lucky if we see one. And this I happened to be able to identify this one, which showed up 2 years ago, because of the broken wing. That's a female with a broken wing. And she produced about 25, she was the only one around for several weeks. And she actually stayed in our yard. I guess maybe because of her broken wing, she decided this was going to be her resting place, and she produced a family of about 25 of these caterpillars, which, amazing thing was, this was during the summer with the storm, which was nominally a tropical storm. By the time it got up to our place, it was just a huge rainstorm, which overflowed our 6-inch rain gauge. And I was in Washington and getting arrested. But when I got back, I thought, well, that butterfly is going to, cannot survive that rainstorm. Where do they go? I mean, they're going to get their wings washed. But all of the larvae was still there, and here that butterfly was still flitting around our yard. And that some of the caterpillars had gone off, and you can see 2 of the butterflies are just emerging from their chrysalis. One of them was a male, and then this one's a female. But we wondered how many of these would make it to Mexico, because they had to travel through Texas, and there was a really bad drought that year. So I wrote an article about that butterfly, and the Mexican scientist read it, and he happened to specialize in monarch butterflies, so he sent me some photos that he took on this mountainous area in Mexico. This is one of the branches. But the butterflies all go to these fir trees and hang on and sort of go to sleep. And this is actually his grandson, looking up at those butterflies. And what he saw was that the trees were in trouble because there's been this persistent drought in this area. And the scientist is trying to persuade the government to plant these trees higher up the mountain where the temperature will be more appropriate for survival of the trees. But now, what's happened since then? There was the next summer, but the number of butterflies who made it to Mexico was reduced 30% that year. But the next year, there was a bigger drought covering the Midwest, and the number that made it was about 59%, yet less than the year before. And then this last summer, I only saw on our property one butterfly, one monarch. I saw 3 on our property, but only one in the area of our backyard where our milkweeds and butterfly bush are. And that one hung around the yard, and by that time, so our butterfly bush had about 15 or 20 of these tiger swallowtails, big yellow butterfly. And the monarch did make one. Well, it landed on the milkweeds, but then flew around the yard and landed on the grass and flew around the barn. He stayed around a couple of hours, flying all around the yard. And then I took some photos of it, and I wondered why she didn't go and lay some eggs on the. I wondered why she didn't go and lay some eggs on the milkweeds. But when I went back inside and looked at the photo, I saw it was male. So then I'm wondering, what I'm afraid of is that they may have passed a tipping point, because they don't travel like birds. They don't travel in pairs. So they require chance encounters. So my suspicion is that male may have been flying around 2 hours looking for a female butterfly and not finding it. Because it went down another 50%. So we'll have to see what happens next year. But other species, there are more than 1 million species associated with coral reefs. They're the rainforest of the ocean. And they're in trouble because several reasons, but it includes the acidification of the ocean and the rising temperature of the ocean causes bleaching in extreme events. It's especially warm that the coral expel their symbiotic algae and die. And we're losing about 1% a year of coral reefs. So the conclusion is there's no way that we can burn all of the fossil fuels without essentially wiping out a large fraction of the species on the planet and causing sea level rise, which would be totally. If we burn all the fossil fuels, we'd melt all the ice. Sea level would go up 250 feet. There's no doubt about that. It's not a scientific debate about it. The only debate is how fast it would melt. So we can't do that. But our governments, it's absurd, the situation, because we have a government in the United States which is encouraging fossil fuel industry to go after every fossil fuel they can find. Tar shale, mining off the coast, mountaintop removal. It doesn't make sense because we know from the science we can't do that. So what do we do about that? Well, if we could stabilize the climate, we would have to phase out coal because that's the huge bars on the unburned bars. The burned bars were the burned part is the perfect part. The big bars are coal and unconventional. That's why I say game over if you're going to go into the unconventional. But you've also got to phase out the coal. You've got to have an alternative for baseload electric power. You can't continue to use coal for that purpose. And we shouldn't be going after every last drop of oil in the most difficult places. We're going to have to figure out how to power the planet beyond these fossil fuels. We better do it now before we wiped everything out. But what's happening is, in fact, the rate of use is actually increasing. This is the rate of emission. So something is out of whack. And the problem is that the fossil fuels are the cheapest energy. They appear to be the cheapest energy. It's very cheap to burn dirt. And you just dig up coal and burn it. It's got a lot of energy. But it's not really cheapest because it's not paying its cost to society. We're allowing the fossil fuel companies to use the atmosphere as their garbage dump without charging them. It's free. So we have to add a fee. We have to make, that's the main thing. We're going to need technology development because we have to replace the energy sources. But the main thing is you've got to make the fossil fuels pay their costs. Then the alternatives can compete, and as that fee on the carbon rises, we'll phase out the fossil fuel. And I argued that we have to give the money not to the government. Don't let the government take this money and make the government bigger. Give the money to the public so that they have the money to make changes and the people who do better than average. If you give an equal amount to every legal resident of the country, then the person who does better than average in limiting his fossil fuel use will make money. He'll get more than he pays in increased energy prices. And that's a conservative way to deal with the problem if you don't enlarge the government and you leave the choices to the individuals and free competition. Stimulates the economy, solves our fossil fuel addiction, and this is the only viable, in my opinion, international approach. You can't go to the United Nations and have 180 nations sitting around the table arguing on how much are you going to reduce yours and how much are you going to reduce yours. Only. You just have China and the U.S. agree that they're going to have a carbon fee, and we're going to put a border duty on products from countries that don't have a carbon fee. And almost every country is going to agree they're going to have a carbon fee so that they can collect the money themselves. I already said that. And so, therefore, there's this organization called Citizens Common Lobby, which has as its objective persuading the government to have a fee and dividend. And that organization is rapidly growing. We're encouraging the formation of new groups. If you want to form a local group or join a local group, you can contact citizensclimatelobby.org. What they do is write op-eds and letters to the editor, and they visit their congresspeople, and they do this very politely. And you know, if they're shoot away, they'll come back again later, and they're very persistent. And if they keep growing, we will get some action, I think. And this is a matter of intergenerational injustice. You know, our parents did not know that by burning fossil fuels they were causing a problem for us, but we can only pretend that we don't. And as you know, our children's trust is one of the big hopes that we can force our government to do something. Basically, what they're saying is, what is your plan? Give us your plan. And the truth is, the government doesn't have it. That's why this is a good idea to sue them and demand them. So the fact, now there's another, I just came back from China, where emergency room. The air pollution is so bad there, my asthma got out of control. But, you know, there's another moral issue here, and that is the one that the developed countries, we burn, since there's a limit on how much carbon we can burn, put in the air. You know, there should be a budget. What right do we have to fill up that whole budget? But the U.S. burned up its share, and then started on China's share, and has put China in a position that if it burns its share, then it's in huge trouble. It's got 350 million people living near sea level. So we have some obligation, I think, to help China deal with this, but we have to get China to not follow our path. But they have the right, and again, it's in our founding of our country. So one of the things that was included in the first sentence is, you know, about the right pursuit of happiness. Well, that's what development is. China wants to raise its people out of poverty. They have the right to energy, and they need energy to do that. We use fossil fuels to replace slavery and to raise standard of living. Well, they have the right to develop also. And so it's not good enough for John Kerry to conclude, okay, we've got an agreement, we've talked with China, and we're both going to tell you, keep each other informed of what we're doing. But we've got to do more than inform China what we're doing. We have some obligation. There are some, we can either reduce the amount of energy we use and try to use it more efficiently, but the black curve for energy intensity is not really, it's declined somewhat globally, but that's not going to get us off of fossil fuels. But carbon intensity, if we replace fossil fuels with carbon-free energies like renewables and nuclear power, we can reduce the carbon intensity down to, it's got to go down actually pretty close to zero. But Sweden and France did a good job. They're the green curves. They've done the best. And they did that in about a 15-year period each, mainly. Both of them did it by nuclear power. And Sweden had hydropower also, so they're less carbon intensive than the rest of us. But you can see that we've got a huge task because all of the renewables are just a few percent. They're just, and I showed you on an earlier graph, the total emissions are going up 3% a year. So all of the renewables that have been developed over the last few decades just take care of 1 year's growth. It's hard. It's not an easy problem. This is for the U.S. The same story is here, and true here also. The renewables are 2%. Well, so the way to do this, the chart I used in China, is that we both have to have. China has to have the carbon fee, and we should be cooperating with them. We have, in many cases, more technology development, and we should cooperate with them in renewables and in nuclear power. That's the only way they're going to stop burning coal at the massive rate that they are burning. And it may, and doing that may, in fact, because they will do things to scale. They're doing more solar, more wind, and more nuclear power development than any other country in the world. And if we cooperate in that and get it to be as good as possible, then it may circle back to the U.S. where we've been really slow. But we're the biggest, they're now the biggest emitter. But in terms of how much is in the atmosphere, we put about more than a quarter of it there, even though our population is much smaller. So I think I'll stop at this point. These are some relevant organizations.
Tell China that they need to build dozens of nuclear reactors, because when the Chinese reactors melt down, we will be downwind, just like we're downwind of Fukushima and we're downwind of Chinese coal.
Yeah.
Can we get questions with the next one? If you have a question, come forward.
It's easy to say, okay, let's use less energy. And let's stop overconsumption. And the fee and dividend concept will actually help a lot in that regard, because when you make the fuel more expensive, it's the easiest way you can keep your carbon footprint low and make money is just consume less of it. But you're not going to stop. The first George Bush said the American lifestyle is not negotiable. Well, that's not really true, but people are not going to give up driving. And I can tell you that in the developing countries, the first thing they want to do as they get more resources is to have personal mobility. But we need to do it with cars that are carbon free, and we can do that. When countries like France and Sweden went down to 30 or 40%, they could. The remaining thing is really mostly vehicles, and they can do that. They could make that carbon free. You can use electricity both to make liquid fuel or to have battery-powered cars. So it's technically possible to go to largely carbon-free energy. And without giving up, because people want to travel, they want to go to Africa once in their life or things, and you're not. We can preach to China and say don't start to become more energy consumption, but we need energy, and frankly, the big issue is if we're going to let life on this planet make it through the 21st century bottleneck, as Ed Wilson calls it, we have to get population under control. And we know how to do that. There are several things that contribute. Women's education and things they'll say is important, but mostly it's development. The countries that have become reasonably wealthy have fertility rates that are below the replenishment level. And that's what we need to have happen in India and places. China is controlling its population by fiat. But we need that to happen in places like Bangladesh and India, and it almost certainly requires that they be allowed to develop. And they're very hardworking people, and they are going to develop. And that's, in that way, we need to do that in order to leave space on the planet for the other species. So highways, you know, I'm afraid they're going to exist, but I think we can still have a planet and allow space for the other species.
Dr. Hansen, I want to thank you so much for alerting the world and our country about the climate crisis, and your suggestion and championing of the fee and dividend idea, I think, is absolutely the right way to go. I totally support you on that. I'm a little concerned about this fixation on nuclear, particularly when you look at a country like Japan that went from 54 nuclear plants to basically 0 at this point, is burning a lot of carbon. It seems that reliance on nuclear is a risky proposition. I'm wondering why you don't look at countries like Germany and the state of California, for example, which is encouraging the growth of renewable energy resources and distributed generation and closing their nuclear plants. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. I'm one of the biggest cheerleaders of those efforts in Germany and California. So far, Germany has spent a lot of money on renewables, and they've reduced their contribution of fossil fuels to their electricity from 62 to 60%. California's fossil fuel use increased because they closed a nuclear plant. It increased a lot. I don't know the exact number. And you just have to look at the facts. You know, I wouldn't fixate on old nuclear technology, which is the 100 plants in the United States are basically 40-year-old technology. We can do much better than that. And that's why I must say that I consider the Democrats and Republicans to be about equally responsible for the fix that we're in. And I think that, you know, what happened was one thing that happened. I turn things off again. If I escape, and I end up with a spider web. Oh, it doesn't show. Well, let me just tell you that the statement in the first State of the Union message of Bill Clinton, he said, we're terminating unnecessary research and development in nuclear power. That was at a time when the Argonne National Laboratory was ready to make some significant advances. They wanted to make a fast reactor. But the point is, I think that what we did then was deeply immoral. What it did was put China in a position where they have no choice. If they want to develop, they've got to burn coal. They would prefer to have nuclear power, but they want it to be safe nuclear power. And they would like it to be plants that you can build in a few years, not 10 years. We've put our nuclear industry in a position where it doesn't make sense to build a nuclear power plant in the United States. We've staffed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with so many lawyers that it takes 10 years to get the paperwork done for a nuclear power plant. So And the problem is, the theory that the anti-nuclear people had was that if we can somehow stop, and and because I'm an environmentalist, I happen to sit with these guys all the time, and I hear how they're thinking. And they think we've got to really get some lawyers and object to this and object to that and make sure that it takes so many years to build that nuclear plant that it's very expensive. And they are quite successful. Well, China is not going to accept that, but they would like the technology to be the best possible and the safest possible. And we can now have passively safe reactors that shut down if there's an earthquake or another anomaly, unlike the Fukushima plant. The alternative is, Russian technology. Russia is happy. Fortunately, we still have, and Westinghouse is building 4 AP1000s in China. And I should just mention one number as an example. California built and started a week ago a solar power plant, which for electricity, it's 5 square miles, and it produces a given amount of power, which is 1/12 the amount that's produced by an AP1000, a General Electric AP1000. So if you want to match it, you need 60 square miles of solar panels, while the nuclear plant covers a half a square mile. So what the energy that China needs, there's no way that they can use solar. So the theory that the anti-nuclear people had, that let's cut nuclear and then automatically these renewables will take over, well, it's not happening. Instead, what you do is assure that coal is used in China, and there's another thing that you're assuring, and that is that we're going to have hydraulic fracturing in the United States up our kazoo. It's not going to be just the places they're doing it now. If we have the combination, and renewables don't give you the whole energy. They have to be supplemented with gas. That will be acquired by hydrofracking. So you've got to look at the pros and cons. You don't just say, oh, there's a potential for something bad for nuclear, so therefore let's rule that out, and then we'll do it with something that's beautiful. There's nothing perfectly beautiful. They've all got pros and cons. And so you've got to, so it was very, I think it's outrageous because it's so asymmetric. As a person who believes that we have to have nuclear, I don't say don't do renewables, but the people who believe we should do renewables, they try to cut off nuclear before it has a chance to compete. We should put a carbon price, and then people can choose. If you don't like nuclear, fine, do it with renewables, but somebody else, the Southeast United States, is not going to use solar. So the point is that the United States has the potential for the best technology in the world. We have the best universities. We can make it as safe as possible. So for us to leave the world dependent on Russian technology is stupid.
In the interest of time, I ask you to keep your questions short and concise. Thank you.
Dr. Hansen, you've done many courageous things, but one of the gutsiest I thought was to include 2 chapters in your book regarding what's been called the Venus syndrome or the Venus scenario. I'm wondering, since the publication of your book, what has been the feedback from your fellow climatologists and any further thinking you have along that dire scenario?
You know, I'm glad you asked me that question. He's asking about the Venus scenario. There's a chapter in my book called In the Year 2525. There's a song so I thought that's a nice jingle. But In that chapter, there were some beings on another planet which their sun was turning into a red giant, which ours will too in a few billion years, but theirs was already doing that, so they had to escape because the red giants will just expand and cover the planet and cook it. So they were traveling, they had discovered that there was this nice planet Earth, and they wanted to come to the Earth and save their civilization. But they got here and found that the Earthlings had destroyed planet Earth, and they found that ice caps were melted, and so the idea was that you had a runaway greenhouse effect. And that, so since then, we've had a conference on runaway greenhouse effect, and I've written the foreword to the book, which is published by, I think, the University of Arizona Press. And I mean to send, that's just a 2-page summary in which I really discuss this Venus syndrome and what can actually happen on the Earth. Now, and what I conclude is that if we burn all the fossil fuels, we cannot get a Venus runaway in the sense that you cook all the carbon out of the crust of the Earth, because the weathering process, it takes the CO2 back out of the atmosphere, and it does that on a 100,000-year time scale. So when we put fossil fuels in the air, it stays in the climate for of the order of 100,000 years. Some of it mixes into the ocean. Most of it mixes into the ocean. But it doesn't go back to the crust, except on the 100,000-year time scale. But that's fast enough that it prevents the escape of hydrogen from the planet. So anyway, the bottom line is that the Earth can't have 700-degree temperatures until the sun has become warmer. It's increasing at a rate of about 10% every billion years. And so within a few billion years, the Earth will get a runaway greenhouse effect like Venus. But what you can get on the time scale of in the year 2525 is a planet that is uninhabitable, or that the only places, if you literally burned all the fossil fuels on those bars, including the unconventional ones and the methane hydrates, then you could make the planet hot enough that only the Himalayas or something, and if we really did that, you'd have people fighting, and I don't know that anyone would survive. So the picture that I had in the book, there was one mistake. I had the ocean boiling. Well, you can't actually get to 100-degree, you can't get to a boiling temperature on the Earth with the fossil fuels. There's not enough to do that. But you could get an uninhabitable planet. So the picture that they saw looking down was actually okay. It was actually a conceivable one if we're so stupid as to burn all the fossil fuels.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. It's really a privilege to be up here with two of my heroes tonight. And I have the honor to be able to introduce to you our next distinguished keynote speaker. Mary Christina Wood is the Philip H. Knight Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the University of Oregon's nationally recognized Environmental and Natural Resources Law Program. She has taught environmental, property, Indian, and public trust law courses for over 20 years. She is the co-author of 2 textbooks, including a brand new book on the public trust. And this fall, she published Nature's Trust, a book that Kathleen Dean Moore calls a new paradigm that can correct the course of history. Professor Gus Speth wrote, "What Silent Spring did for our perception of the environment, Nature's Trust should do for our perception of environmental protection." It is a must-read for lawyers and non-lawyers alike. It was 4 years ago, just after this conference, that I was thinking deeply about climate crisis and how I could bring my own legal skills to bear on the issue. And I heard that Mary Wood had some ideas about this. So I went into a meeting with her thinking mostly about environmental statutory law, the law I have been practicing for my whole career. And I walked out of that meeting with this wild notion that I would help young people and attorneys bring atmospheric trust litigation all over the country and indeed all over the world. And Mary Wood has a way of inspiring people to do things that are on par with her level of work and dedication to action. The past 4 years of working on atmospheric trust litigation, the legal approach that she originated to address the climate crisis, has just confirmed for me the wisdom behind her vision. She saw a problem that faced humanity, and she told the legal story of how we could solve that problem. And she told it beautifully, she told it simply, with amazing writing. If you haven't read her articles, you should. And she told it in a way that young people could understand. She made this long-standing fundamental law of public trust relevant to every one of us in a time of great urgency and in a time when we desperately need our laws and our governments to make sense and to work for us and for future generations. There's so much more I could say about her, but in the interest of time, I just want to leave you with one final comment. For those of you who don't know her personally, Mary Wood walks the walk like nobody I know. You saw in the film with her biking with her children and gardening, and Mary Wood lives on a hill that's like this steep, and the woman pedals up that hill. She is religious about biking. They're an urban homesteading family. They've reduced their waste and their food supply significantly, and you will never see her with throwaway disposable anything. She regularly refuses air travel in favor of Skype, and she does all of this with grace. She is a shining example for all of us, and it's my honor to give you Mary Christina Wood, otherwise known as Mims.
Well, I am so honored to be here and so honored by Julia's introduction of me. I just cannot begin to tell you what a hero Julia is to me and the ATL attorneys in this room and the children who are behind these lawsuits. Thank you, Julia, so much. One little technical matter for our sound and light person, if I could have a little more light up here, that would be good. Okay. Let's begin by thanking the students. The students put on this conference, and it is more work than we can possibly imagine. I told the students in an earlier reception that they don't even understand the kind of synapses that occur during this conference. So they will never see the results of 99% of their work. But I want you to join me right now in giving them a huge round of applause. Okay. We are the living beneficiaries of a priceless trust. This trust holds the waters, the air, the wildlife, the forests, and all that encompasses the web of life. We rely on this trust for our sole survival, and so will our descendants. We share this trust with all the species out there that fill us with wonder and awe, and we also share this trust with all of the microbes and the plankton and the bees, because those are the indispensable species to us to maintain the balance of life, to let us survive on this earth. And so this trust, this exquisitely balanced, spectacularly complex, absolutely vital earth endowment supports all life systems, and without it functioning, life will not persist. That is law. That is law. That is nature's law. And we would be fools not to recognize it as the supreme law of the land, or ever to think for a moment that it doesn't have jurisdiction over our survival. All of our ancestors recognized that truth. And so it should come as no surprise that one of the original understandings of any government formed by any people concerns the people's rights in this essential ecology. As part of the social contract between the people and their government, the people hold back for themselves inalienable property rights to crucial resources. This principle was just underscored and announced in an opinion handed down 2 months ago by Chief Justice Castile of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And the court there overturned a statute passed by the Pennsylvania legislature that promoted fracking, a practice that has fueled so much of the contamination in that state. And Justice Castile began his opinion by declaring that the citizens hold inherent and indefeasible rights in essential ecology. He said those rights are of such great and essential quality as to be ensconced as inviolate. They amount to a basic constitutional right that we, the people, hold and have always held. Well, a legal right held by the citizens gives rise to a duty on the part of the government to protect that right. Since the beginning of this nation, courts have declared the government as trustee of those natural resources we all depend on. And a trust is a concept of property law, which just means that certain assets are managed by one party for the benefit of another. And so the beneficiaries of this great public trust are we, the people, both present and future generations. The 1872 case, Illinois Central Railroad, said that the public trust sets a limit on what government can give away to private parties. The court confronted a situation there it had never seen before. It actually confronted a situation where the legislature of Illinois had conveyed the whole shoreline of Chicago to a private railroad company. You know, can you imagine that? The people needed this shoreline for fishing and navigation and commerce, and here it was just conveyed away. And the court said the legislature didn't have the power to do that. In fact, it said that would be a grievance which would never be long borne by a free people. Well, when you understand that the ecology of nature's trust supports our very survival, and no less so for future generations and our children than for us, you can see that this public trust principle provides for the endurance rather than the expiration of our nation. It prevents our political leaders from abusing their absolute power over our natural resources to serve their own political interests at our expense. The trust comes twin-born with democracy itself. It's so basic that its incarnations are found in many, many other nations throughout the world. And yet, you could think of many politicians these days who would like to ignore these rights or claim they don't exist, or who presume their authority is somehow superior to these rights. You could think of many politicians in this nation who would like to take campaign financing money from the fossil fuel industries and then open up our nation's coastline to oil drilling, and our public lands to coal mining, and our neighborhoods to natural gas fracking, and invite huge mining companies to explode the tops off the gentle Appalachian Mountains. You can imagine many politicians who would allow uncontrolled carbon emissions to flood our atmosphere. And at times, this legislative power seems almighty to us. But no legislator or no legislative body is above the public trust. as a constitutional principle embodying the inalienable rights of the people, government literally can't rid itself of the trust obligation. The court in Illinois Central said, and this is a quote, "The state can no more abdicate its trust over property in which the whole people are interested than it can abdicate its police powers in the administration of government." So you might all be wondering now, well, why haven't environmental advocates asserted these principles very often? And it's because for the last 40 years, we've all been consumed with the morass of statutory law. In the 70s and thereafter, Congress passed dozens of environmental statutes, and the states passed many of their own, and every statute spawned a morass of regulations, and this law now consumes so many thousands of pages that I can say for sure there's not one lawyer, even Professor Bill Rogers, who has actually read all environmental law. Now, if you were to picture this statutory law in physical terms, you might imagine each statute as a very deep gopher hill filled with quicksand. And there are thousands of these across the field of environmental law, and we step into these statutory holes, and sometimes we never emerge because the sheer complexity just draws us deeper and deeper into this maze of tunnels that veer further and further away from the fundamental principles and rights and from the ecological reality that shows only in the light of day. Well, let's look at what this environmental law has brought us. It has brought clear cutting, toxic pollution, nuclear waste, mountaintop removal, strip mining, wetlands destruction, fracking, deep sea drilling, species extinctions, dried up rivers, drinking water contamination, ocean acidification, dead zones in the sea, and almost indescribable mutilation of landscapes across this nation. So sure, we must be grateful for what it did stop, and it did stop a lot, but the real onslaught to Earth has taken place since these statutes were passed. In fact, in just the last 30 years, Earth's natural ecosystems have declined by 33%. That's during the period of environmental law. It turns out environmental law hasn't really prevented damage, it's hastened it. And so you might wonder, how could this possibly be? Because environmental groups are making heroic efforts to challenge government action. They always have. And they've won some crucial victories. But the problem, as Ross Gelbsman writes, is that we're all running around trying to put out all these fires, but no one's going after the pyromaniac. There is a political rot eating out environmental law from its core. And that is what we have to face. So let's locate the source of this dysfunction. Nearly all environmental statutes have this in common. They rely on agencies to carry out their mandates, and under the statutes, these agencies exert tremendous dominion over nature. And while the statutes were all designed to prevent contamination to the environment, nearly all have provisions allowing these agencies to permit damage. And so, you know, these permit provisions were never supposed to swallow up the purposes of the statute, but that is, in fact, what has happened because agencies use these provisions regularly to allow harm to whatever resources they control. At every level, agencies have turned environmental law inside out. Well, environmental law now sanctions unthinkable oppression of local communities. Consider Appalachia, a region under siege by mountaintop removal companies that literally go in and blow the tops of mountains off to get at buried coal. There can be thousands of explosions across Appalachia at any given day. The scale compares to war. And over the last 30 years, the coal companies have beheaded 500 mountains. And then they've dumped these mountaintops into the valleys below, and they've obliterated 2,000 miles of stream. A community leader in West Virginia described to me the area near her home as a ravaged moonscape. And she said, Mims, I flew over this a couple times, and I couldn't even talk. I thought, how could this possibly be? And I thought, that's the problem. Permits for mountaintop removal fall to the federal and state agencies implementing statutory law. And of course, all are armed with the mandate to protect the environment, but instead, these agencies have all used these laws to legalize the blowing up of Appalachia and the poisoning of its watersheds. It's as if government has turned against the people. With few exceptions, the bureaucratic mindset of agencies today is that permits are there to be granted. And so while the statutes expressed all these goals of clean air, pure water, and recovered species, The agencies substitute an entirely new focus. How much pollution and resource scarcity can we impose on communities, children, and citizens? Well, the first step towards solving the problem is just to stop pretending environmental law is protective. It clearly isn't. In fact, it's become dangerous. But we next have to ask, why do agencies behave the way they do? Because we know, on one hand, that the agencies are filled with so many good people. We know many. They sincerely want to do the right thing, but we know, on the other hand, that's not nearly enough. Well, the basic problem lies in the vast discretion that agencies enjoy under these environmental statutes. And Congress gave this vast discretion on one assumption, and that was that agencies were expert, they'd act objectively for the good of the public in line with the statutes. But instead, many use their discretion to benefit their own political goals, which often mean the goals of the industries they regulate. It turns out that discretion is a magnet for industry influence, and industry groups exert relentless pressure on agencies to ease regulation, and they purchase this influence through campaign contributions to the president and state governors. And then those leaders pay back the favor by appointing industry leaders to the top ranks of these agencies. Well, with well-positioned political operatives working within an agency, industry takes a hand in regulating itself. And then the staffers fall in line with this agenda because they're simply afraid of getting fired. Well, captured agencies look at the industry in a light of it's a client that they must serve. And then discretion becomes the legal conduit through which the agency delivers our public resources to corporate hands through these permits. EPA has been described as an agency under siege by this influence. So then we have to ask, well, is there any constraint on this abuse of power? We live in a democracy, and citizens are supposed to be the watchdogs of government, but the public has become less and less involved in environmental processes. And this is undoubtedly due to the complexity that agencies have created. They create this vocabulary of acronyms that blather an alphabetic mix that's just meaningless to the public. A mother protesting a toxic facility near her children's school might have to find herself speaking in terms of ARARs and MCLs and NESHAPs and SIPs and MACT and BDACT and BACT. And really few incoherencies impede democracy more than the utter lack of accessible language by which citizens can hold their government accountable. Within this vocabulary of environmental law, actions that might well be described as crimes against humanity, or relentless assaults against the community, or theft against future generations, or even reckless endangerment of innocent children, they all succumb to the terminology of this antiseptic regulatory system. And so then the system spews out permissions that revolt the reasonable mind, but egregious harms become defined as permissible and legitimate, fully legalized exploits. So dehumanizing is this techno-jargon and so capable of casting a mind-numbing pall over the hazards of environmental damage, that society's most destructive inclinations now have become normal. So with citizens not gaining much traction, you might ask, well, what about the other branches of government? They're supposed to exert checks and balances so that any one branch doesn't exert tyrannical power. But we know the legislative branch is also co-opted by these campaign contributions, so that leaves the courts. And this is a very complicated thing that I spent 100 pages developing. So I'm just going to, please forgive me, I'm just going to summarize it right now. It's more complicated than this, but the courts assume still that these agencies are expert and neutral and act objectively, so they give undue deference to the agencies in these environmental cases. And so the bottom line is that the executive branch now exercises something of an environmental tyranny. Environmental law has become the cane upon which humanity leans as it walks the plank towards its own destruction. And now we confront climate crisis. Well, the analyst Richard Heinberg captured our situation well, I thought, recently when he wrote, "The scale of what is at stake runs straight off the charts. The decisions that need to be made, and soon, may well determine whether civilization survives." Parents, if you have been focusing on soccer games and piano lessons, you might be in for a big shock. Your children's future will be determined by the actions you take today. Gus Speth, the former dean of the Yale School of Forestry, wrote a book called Bridge at the Edge of the World, and he wrote in the foreword that if we continue business as usual, the world, and this is his words, quote, won't be fit to live in by mid-century. Won't be fit to live in. Parents, have you thought about how old your child will be at mid-century, say 2050? And are your children ready for a world that would be unfit to live in? We face mind-blowing urgency because of nature's tipping points and feedback loops, which we've just heard about. And our window of opportunity is closing so fast that every single day now counts. Even back in 2007, the head of the United Nations climate panel told the world that what we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. He said, this is the defining moment. So how's President Obama responding to this urgency? He's madly pushing through fossil fuel projects. His administration decided to auction coal from federal public lands in Wyoming for export to China. He's opened the Arctic up to oil drilling. He's relentlessly promoted fracking. He still hasn't comprehensively regulated carbon dioxide pollution. He boasts that his administration has added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. And at the same time, he takes doublespeak to an entirely new level because he tells the American public that we should be doing everything possible to save this planet for our children and grandchildren. But at least you will be relieved to know that in all of this, your government is working very hard implementing environmental law. In fact, the State Department just issued a multi-volume environmental impact statement on the proposed Keystone Pipeline, which would transport some of the dirtiest fuels on the planet 1,700 miles through the United States over the Ogallala Aquifer that supplies drinking water to a major swath of this nation. And in Dr. Hansen's own words, this could be game over for the climate system, but the State Department CIS found no significant environmental impact. The legitimacy of environmental law is fast imploding. This is obvious by growing demonstrations in this country. Over 85,000 people have now taken a pledge to engage in civil disobedience if the Keystone Pipeline is approved, and those numbers are going up every day. And this is not some fringe movement. This is a rising tide of citizens from mainstream society that includes among those arrested former congressmen, famous authors, and well-known scientists, and celebrities, and veterans, and business owners, and doctors, and nurses, and pastors, and nuns, and grandparents, and mothers, and fathers with children at their side. And when you see coverage of this, you see that the citizens have felt impelled to act out of the danger that they feel for their own children. Look at the video when you get a chance on YouTube. If the entire tribal council of the Nez Perce Nation in Idaho forming a human blockade against a road at the border of their reservation, and that was to stop a megaload carrying equipment to the tar sands of Canada. And you'll see in that video 250 protesters just flooding in to back these tribal leaders, and you'll hear their speeches in their children's defense and in defense of Mother Earth, all while a 23-foot-high, 400-ton megaload stretching a football field wide or lawn comes at them in the dark of night. And then you read of this Oregon protester over in the port of Umatilla who put his arms through these metal encasements in the freezing dark on a December night and locked himself to the axle behind another megaload. And he says, and he's in the paper quoted, "I've done this for my children." And then you see a video of this Umatilla elder, a grandmother, getting arrested for putting her body down across the road in front of a megaload. And she says, with tears streaming down her eyes and her cheeks, she says, our children are going to die. If we don't stop this now, it's going to be on our shoulders. And so my point is that when you see these people and hear those words, and then you go to the scientific studies that Dr. Hansen and others have produced from around the world that give the strongest possible warnings that continued fossil fuel emissions will threaten civilization as we know it and our children's future on this planet, you just know that fate has delivered us all into an almost unbelievable moment in human history. So why do we now focus on our inalienable rights? Because never before in the history of this nation has our fundamental ecology been so ferociously and ignorantly destroyed, and with such dire consequences to young people. Looking back, we see these same primordial rights surfacing at epic times through history. These principles stand no less revolutionary for our time and our crisis than the forcing of the Magna Carta on the English monarchy or Gandhi's Great Salt March to the sea. Just as those generations did, we must hold government accountable as a trustee of our commonwealth. And as we run into running out, we need a whole new set of instructions for this government we've got. The public trust is the very antithesis of the discretion model that has bred corruption in statutory law. It conceives of government officials as public trustees rather than as arbitrary political actors, and it presents nature as a priceless endowment instead of some vague environment. And we citizens stand as beneficiaries holding a clear property interest in the Commonwealth instead of weakened political constituents with increasingly desperate appeals to bring to our public officials. And the trust views polluters as despoilers of our trust rather than as stakeholders controlling the political sphere. So now let's get down to brass tacks. Gerald Torres describes this trust as the law's DNA because it imposes a set of organic instructions on government that apply to any scale. And these instructions are called in the law fiduciary obligations. And that Pennsylvania fracking opinion I mentioned strongly affirmed all of these. So I want to explain just four. There's many more, but I'll explain four. First, the public trust requires government to protect and restore the trust instead of allowing damage to trust assets. Well, this is so basic. You would not put your valuable savings in the hands of a trustee only to allow that trustee to give it away to other parties and ultimately bankrupt your trust, right? And courts emphasize this is an active duty. Trustees can't just sit idle and permit trust assets to be destroyed on their watch, which pretty much sums up our government's approach to the climate crisis. The trust also demands a macro approach. It forces action to maintain the health of public assets, and it does not allow trustees to cause substantial impairment to the trust. Remember those words, substantial impairment. Our agencies ran that substantial impairment stop sign long ago. And so the trust approach calls for a complete overhaul of the permit system. I would venture that a good many public servants working in the agencies today would welcome turning their talent and expertise to restoring the trust rather than just simply moving it more towards collapse. Okay, that was one. A second one is the duty of loyalty. I'm going to test you on these at the end. Trustees must make decisions to benefit the beneficiaries and no one else. They must banish all self-interest and all temptation for that. Courts enforce this. They understand that trustees have immense control over property. And so in the private sphere, they will void decisions tainted by a conflict of interest. Well, if we applied that standard to our public environmental trustees, we could frontally challenge the present system of campaign contributions. Our modern culture understands all too well, you all understand, that the contributions cause entanglement, which then causes self-interested decision-making by our elected officials. The problem is not that this corruption goes unrecognized, but that it has become institutionalized. Citizens seem resigned to it because they just don't know of any other paradigm that would yield a higher, more ethical standard of behavior from their government. But is it really that hard for us to imagine courts enforcing the duty of loyalty against legislatures and voiding their tainted decisions and sending them back? The Pennsylvania opinion I mentioned said the legislature is a trustee and that the trustee, here's a quote now, is a trust asset. Well, of course, it said the trustees must achieve the highest and best use of public resources for society. Environmental law, by contrast, hands out free permits without demanding whether the social value of the activity justifies annihilating our resources. Do you all remember the Onceler and the Lorax who cut down the truffle trees to create those unnecessary needs? What were the needs? Is that right? Hey, kids, where are the kids? Okay. Well, that has become the story of our time. Today's industry produces billions of marginally useful products that flood the market, and many of them are from China, only to leave ravaged ecosystems beside the production. And in the mythology of modern-day regulation, nearly all industrial activity brings benefit to society, and all to the same degree. A plant producing bubble gum receives no less favorable treatment under the Clean Water Act than a plant producing a life-saving medical device. Well, while a reasonable person might assume that in times of scarcity, we might actually decide to reorder the use of natural resources to those that carry the most essential need for society, most regulators don't think in those terms, and this duty would force them to. A fourth and last duty I want to mention is the duty to administer the trust for the people overall rather than to benefit private interests that seek commercial gain. Now, I know you're used to hearing the opposite from our leaders, who tell us we must approve destructive proposals in order to create more jobs. Port officials up and down the coast here say we must allow coal export facilities in Oregon and Washington so that we can create a few dozen longshoreman jobs. But when we understand that these projects push us closer to climate catastrophe and closer to very dangerous effects for our children, this justification becomes absurd. After all, citizens would not argue for lethal government policies just to employ a few more cemetery workers. And so now, of course, with those said, there's much work to be done to infuse these trust principles into the modern environmental bureaucracy. And this is the time for those many good people, and there are many of them working within the agencies, to step up in the agencies and take the initiative to do this. The trust is a full paradigm change. It changes what we count as common sense. And so it goes beyond any specific issue, but clearly one of its most important applications now is to our fossil fuel infrastructure. Well, the trust demands that we honestly assess how much fossil fuels we have left and budget accordingly. And now President Obama would have us believe that we just tapped some major oil gushers in this country that will bring our nation energy independence sooner than we can believe. For just a moment, put aside the problem that fossil fuels are filthy fuels from production to combustion. Put aside the fact that we are now using treacherous technology that takes us deeper beneath the ocean floor, deeper into the fissures that intersect aquifers, and deeper into the pores of the mountains. And please put aside those millions of people who have died of respiratory failure from the burning of coal, and the fact that the mercury from coal-fired plants is nearly ubiquitous in U.S. waterways now and contaminates the bloodstreams of people who eat the fish that live in those waterways. And by all means, put aside the horrific consequences of those accidents that occur with alarming regularity, such as the pipeline spills and the explosions and the derailments and all that. The fact is, even if we were awash in oil and other fossil fuels, and even if they were not so problematic in these other ways, we would already reach the point of scarcity. Because as Dr. Hansen has explained so well, the scarcity we face lies in the limited atmospheric space available for absorbing more carbon dioxide. And Bill McKibben has explained this math quite clearly as carbon math. He said, if you look at the reserves that the fossil fuel corporations have on their books, there are enough fossil fuels to pollute our atmosphere with 5 times the carbon dioxide capable of causing planetary disaster. In other words, our atmosphere does have a carbon budget, and industry is planning to blow through it 5 times over. Bill McKibben points out that industry counts these reserves as assets that it owns that are, as he puts it, economically above ground, even though the fuel presently lies below ground. He writes, this industry, and this industry alone, holds the power to change the physics and chemistry of our planet, and we're planning to use it. It's little wonder he calls the fossil fuel industry public enemy number 1 to the survival of our planetary civilization. Well, when we confront that scarcity that comes from the fact that the atmospheric dumpster for carbon is nearly full, then the rush to develop new sources of fossil fuel is an absolute fool's errand. Either that or it's a collective suicide mission. So when President Obama tells us that America is closer to energy independence than we've been in decades, we should respond yes. But are we any closer to gaining independence from that climate system? Okay, in all this, there's another question that needs asking, and it is not answered by your environmental statutory law. Given that the corporations themselves don't have the inclination to walk away from $20 trillion of profit, or many trillions of profit, don't we now have to rethink whether these corporations actually have property rights to exploit these remaining reserves no matter where they're located? Shouldn't we do a fresh audit using public trust principles to ask whether these reserves are really economically above ground and can be claimed by the corporations as their assets or their property? I know there's another discussion to be had about corporations, period. I have to leave that, don't have time for that, but have those discussions. But in this question, if there's a common theme to public trust cases, is this. The profiteers didn't have the property rights they assumed they did. In fact, the public had them. Well, most courts hold that rights granted in violation of the public trust do not give rise to compensable takings if they are retracted. And so perhaps we should not assume that the corporations have these vested property rights to a resource that, if fully exploited, would cook the planet. Perhaps the law has more logic than that. The fact is, though, whenever legal and economic tools are used, no matter what we do to keep those reserves below ground, we have to abide by the carbon budget of the planet. And that means we really can't avoid a conversation about what a responsible reaction to scarcity might look like. It looks a lot different now than if leaders had faced up to their responsibility years ago. Analysts say we have to move at wartime speed to replace these fossil fuels with benign sources of energy like wind and solar in order to avoid climate tipping points. And I don't know how we get around the need for budgeting remaining reserves and prioritizing uses. Tom Gleason wrote an editorial last week here in which he said, every drop of oil we can get our hands on ought to be used to construct renewable energy now. Really? You mean to say that we shouldn't use the remaining oil on driving our children to out-of-state volleyball meets or endless trips to the shopping mall, or maybe as an input for that wonderful plastic lid that crowns our coffee cup when we take it out of the coffee shop? As one of my colleagues has observed, we passengers don't like it when dessert runs out in the dining room of the Titanic. And that may be. But President Obama has never even asked the American public to just stop and think before they drive. The fact is that most of our leaders just simply project this attitude that global warming doesn't need our immediate attention. And to me, that's the real global warming pause. So to address climate crisis, we have to meet nature's requirements head on, and we have to ask those difficult questions now. But those requirements come down to carbon math, as Dr. Hansen has explained. And his international team of scientists has calculated that to restore atmospheric equilibrium, we need to reduce global carbon emissions by 6% a year starting now. Hey, take note, everyone. That's a number. Got it? Nature isn't requiring a new study or a new comment period or new AIS. We're talking about actual emissions reduction to avoid catastrophic tipping points. But as this number gets bigger, this energy descent gets steeper. And every single day we wait and delay, it's harder and harder to do it. In fact, how we started action back in 2005, they estimated that we could have just reduced carbon emissions annually by 3.5 a year in order to achieve the equilibrium by the end of the century. And in just 8 years, 3.5 has now turned into 6. And if we dither until 2020, that 6% becomes 15%. At some point, these annual cuts will be impossible to accomplish. And that is when our window of opportunity slams shut, and we essentially leave our children inside this heating greenhouse we've created. So the project we face is not little things. It is a wartime project, or on the scale of a wartime project. This is global atmospheric defense, and it can't be accomplished without governmental leadership, because one of the most effective tools to reduce carbon would be that carbon tax and dividend that Dr. Hansen described. But the challenge goes well beyond just a tax and dividend even. Government needs to form a macro response that spans all sectors. And it has to use all tools available to it, from subsidies to regulation, to land purchases, to management, and so forth. And we know from years of experience that the legislature and the executive branch, they won't act unless they're forced to by the courts. And so this is the time to call that third branch into active duty. A global campaign that you've heard about called Atmospheric Trust Litigation was launched 3 years ago by our Children's Trust, which is the Eugene-based organization, to force government to reduce these carbon emissions, and the ATL lawsuits were filed in 2011. The Oregon case right now is pending before the Oregon Court of Appeals, and I'm so happy to say that both of the young plaintiffs, Kelsey Juliana and Olivia Chernak, are with us tonight, so I want to give them a hand. Thank you. It is just so courageous of youth to stand up. You know, someone wrote a column recently in which she said, you know, parents, if you heard a burglar in the house, would you send your kids down to see what's up? And by not addressing climate, we're kind of, you know, putting our kids' future on the line here. But anyway, the public trust action asserts these rights of youth to inherit a stable atmosphere. And these cases demand that the federal government and the states, the sovereign trustees, simply produce carbon recovery plans to carry out the 6% reduction. So courts would not tell government trustees which measures to select to bring down carbon. That's their job, after all, the trustees' job. But courts can force the trustees to develop a plan and then show they are actually implementing it. This is not some radical judicial remedy. Courts have forced government to make plans and carry them out in many other cases, including, you know, circumstances of school busing and prison reform and treaty rights. And compare that situation to the situation you face today in climate. Dr. Hansen wrote a brief with Dan Galbraith, an attorney here in town. Wonderful brief. It's available on the website of our Children's Trust, in which he said, failure to act becomes a decision to eliminate the option of preserving a habitable climate system. When you look at the impacts of climate crisis, the severity, the duration, the tipping points, the fact that extreme climate change would leave our nation uninhabitable, you can only hope that these judges realize that they have the planet on their docket. But some of the lower courts have dismissed some of these cases, saying it's not their job to step into climate crisis. That's the job of the other branches. But the fundamental pillar of any trust is judicial recourse against a delinquent trustee. Without that, it wouldn't be a trust, it would be a tyranny. And I often wonder, you know, how would law professors explain an impotent outcome to our legal system with respect to climate? Would we tell our students and young people, you know, after our window is closed, sorry, the entire body of law that served this country for over 200 years had no principled way of imposing responsibility to evade the pollution that will bring catastrophe in your lifetime. The legal system was just too brittle for judges to have an impact, and yes, even though they were presented with a logical remedy structure well within their judicial tradition, that could have forced a response in time. Do we tell them that? Let's instead tonight focus on the really remarkable potential of the American judiciary. Because we know throughout history, courts have decided transformative cases. And reading the Illinois opinion, you know, you would have had the sense, I think, that this would have been an easy case for those justices, and that they would have had no hesitation to hold government accountable under the very same doctrine they applied to the Chicago shoreline. Judges back then said, listen to the control art of that great sin, which is not just a concern to the whole people of the state, should be placed into the hands of a private corporation. You can practically hear those justices say today it wouldn't be listened to. The government would let our fossil fuels pollute our atmosphere, threatening our children's future and the habitability of this nation. It would not be listened to. But let's admit, this comes down to judicial courage, too. Chief Justice Castile, who wrote the lead opinion in the Pennsylvania fracking case, which is undoubtedly now the most comprehensive and resounding judicial interpretation of trust, said in public remarks at his investiture that the true power of the courts comes from, this is a quote, the moral authority clearly derived from the citizens' support for the law. A courageous judge thinks about which side of history he or she wants to be on and draws the resolve to enforce legal rights of citizens who collectively assert the moral imperative to do so. So we, the people, must manifest our moral authority and the government's trust obligation in this climate crisis. Well, citizenship, as we all know, is the price we pay for democracy. If we want freedom, our citizenship must be both constant and conspicuous. For too long, we thought it was just going to the polls or maybe sending a letter to our congressman. And how many parents these days teach or model citizenship to their children? A popular bumper sticker says, citizenship is not a spectator sport. Conspicuous citizenship often means showing up and bringing others to city council hearings, to the steps of the legislature, or along a pipeline route. This morning in Los Angeles, 100 citizens launched the Great March for Climate Action to take climate urgency to America's doorsteps from coast to coast, and Kelsey Juliana, Oregon's ATL plaintiff, will join that march 2,000 miles this summer. So call your relatives across the country and ask them to walk with her. And across this region, citizens are standing up and they're saying, none shall pass, to the onslaught of proposals that would turn our beautiful Northwest into an industrial border, a world gateway for fossil fuel exports to Asia. Well, if you believe that citizens and local officials of this region have the will to withhold a crucial link in this global scheme of fossil fuel exports, you can see the leverage that this region alone holds over global policy. And in the very same way, moral authority has mobilized people all along the Keystone Route. Just last week, a judge blocked the pipeline's route through Nebraska, and last fall, a federal judge blocked the mega load route going through Idaho, and then they rerouted through Oregon. Anyway, one has to wonder, when the corporations designed these routes, did they not even think to consider that these communities might withhold consent or crucial links in the chain of climate destruction? Did they not think about that? The point is that we need now more than ever a conspicuous, consolidated show of moral authority. But we know, too, that these proposals will just keep coming at us until we create a new way of life that allows us to live in harmony with the moral authority we assert. And the fact is, all of us find ourselves trapped in a deep gulf between our values and our consumption. We find ourselves participating daily with the very system we resist. We can only begin to climb out of this gulf by rejecting the waste, the mass consumption, and the materialism that brought us this crisis. And truly, many rational people are now coming to terms with this on their own and changing their personal lifestyle. And others we know won't do that and will need a price on carbon to reduce their consumption. But many of us believe that we ought to be the change we want to see in the world. And so, perhaps it's time for us to recognize that mass consumption long ago left the realm of human need and entered the zone of the absurd, creating a world of seat warmers, TV clickers, leaf blowers, and shrink-wrapped ready-to-eat boiled eggs. Some analysts say that if we want to sustain this lifestyle, we will need a new Earth in 16 years. And yet that's the one thing we can't seem to find at the mall. Richard Heinberg and others show that even if we were to make a total commitment to renewable energy, we could not possibly support our mass consumption and the capitalist growth economy as we know it. It is time to face the fact that much of our consumer culture must die if we are to live. And so now, we're still in that gulf now. We do have to know, how do we find those limits? As individuals, we need to somehow relocate and repurpose our consumption, reclaim our consumer autonomy, rebuild our economic communities on a scale in which we can actually participate. And that does mean wresting our lives out of the pervasive control of multinational corporations. And the most promising way forward that I've seen is called relocalization. You can call it a number of things, but I call it relocalization. And basically just is a strategy to liberate communities from the high carbon global economic dependence that they have by creating local businesses and systems to serve as many needs as possible, like food and energy and transportation, knowing we can't withdraw it completely from the global economy, but get as many things sourced locally as possible. It means, as David Cornell says, moving our business from Wall Street to Main Street. The strategy here is to build resilience, sustainability, and self-sufficiency at the local level. It's both a jumpstart to carbon reduction and a lifeline in climate disaster. And so I would really like to see these conversations be taken to communities all over the place, and for us to have some serious R&D on that as a solution. Because if we look to just a few generations ago in World War II, we see that the nation produced 40% of its food supply from backyard victory gardens. That victory food traveled about 50 feet to the dinner table, whereas today's food travels 1,400 miles. So every time we eat from that global food system, we perpetuate the very fossil fuels we need to phase out. Well, where relocalization is taking place in the city here in Eugene, farmers markets are ubiquitous, and torn up lawns sprout crops as people become producers of part of their own food supply. Sharon Aztec writes that this new domestic economy allows citizens to live life as though we hold the world and our particular piece of it in trust for future generations. And so this relocalization must be both massive and urgent to begin the carbon reduction. And we may get carbon tax, of course, too, but we can't wait for that point. We have to build a safety net against the climate disasters that are coming at us. And we have to recognize this like a wartime effort. And so in every community, we need to create these local systems to produce and distribute food, and to transport people with very little fossil fuel, and to make the transition to renewable energy, and to handle waste. The point I want to make is that this is all hands on deck time, and we need every single human to take initiative. In World War II, no one sat on the sidelines. People in businesses stepped up and they offered whatever talent they could to the war effort. Well, there's another dimension to this, because Alex Steffen, author of World Change, and says, the magnitude of our crises and the speed with which they are unfolding mean that the solutions we need to embrace are not going to be the same sort of solutions we're used to thinking of now. In other words, we have to think outside the box to find solutions, and this may not be easy, because our conveniences have enslaved us to a mentality where we just can't imagine a way of life missing even one little detail of our present consumption. I mean, how many times have we been told that will never work? But if we focus back on just our basic needs and safety, we may often find that we have much of the infrastructure already that could be repurposed, and that the purpose we're putting our infrastructure to is locked into a reality that's fast slipping away. I'll just give one example. Can you imagine, if we want to increase bicycling, do we add more bike lanes on the side of roads where bicyclists could be hit by 2-ton passing cars? Or could we instead think of repurposing our roads entirely, some of them, for bike priority? The point is, we need to scale down our thinking to the local level, but we also need to scale up our thinking in terms of possibilities. And the other point is, while we in this community are so fortunate to have local leaders who are just taking this on, I mean, I really want to thank them. But many communities don't have that, and we can't even rely on our local leaders now. The job is too immense. And so citizens and every one of us has to participate in this great transition. You have to think in terms of systems and take on a project. For example, if you want to give citizens of your community the means of making, let's say, homemade bread from local wheat, well, you will need to convince the local farmers to grow the wheat, and then you will need a business person to resurrect a local mill to process the grain into flour, right? And finally, you'll need a way to distribute the locally grown milled flour to the consumers in your town. But before you say this sounds like a job for the little red hen, let me tell you that in this community, a citizen named Harry McCormick took exactly that project on. And I personally owe my 4 loaves of homemade bread every week to his initiative. So your project may not start that big. Maybe it's just figuring out a compost system in your employee lunchroom or something. But whatever it is, please do something. Even outside of the law you're used to. Do anything. Just don't do nothing. And if you think for a moment that you have a moment to spare in getting started on your project, think again. Because if you want an analogy to the situation we're in, I might offer this. It's as if humanity has jumped out of an airplane 20,000 feet high with a parachute, but can't find the cord to open it. We all need to find a cord and pull it now. And so with that, let me close by just inviting you to consider the amazing time we live in. This is our time. This is our moment in history. It belongs to no other generation. If you ever felt that your life was without purpose, think again. Because you were born into a purposeful time. And it would be a tragedy for you to sit out this moment, dreaming, express, or reading magazines, and wandering the malls, wondering what next to buy. There is a heroic role for every single person in this community and on this planet, because it's going to take all of us to remake our systems so that our children and grandchildren have a chance of thriving and surviving. You can't save the world alone, but just to show the world can't be saved without you. And know that people all over this planet are uniting in this moment. They are rising from the blasted hollows of Appalachia and from the cancer alleys of the Mississippi corridor and from the evicted fishing villages of Alaska. They are rising from the fallout zones of Fukushima and the typhoon-struck cities of the Philippines. They are rising from the island of Tuvalu to the scorched Australian outback and from all those places where the immoral mountains leave their last glaciers into the sea. We, the people, are rising across this planet in a kind of patriotism that we've never seen before. It is a patriotism asserting the natural rights that have pulsed through humanity from time immemorial. And this is a patriotism that's growing every bit as incensed, undaunted, expectant, and revolutionary as other acts of patriotism, but it no longer aligns with national borders, because governments around the world have turned their environmental power against their own people in alliance with multinationals. Our planetary patriotism does not draw its power from the barrel of a machine gun or the toss of a bomb, because we plant stakes in the fertile common ground that we find across borders. And so as sure as those seas are rising, we, humanity, are a rising tide in defense of life on Earth. And together, I hope you will vow with me to assert not the power of life, but the trust of life. Thank you very much.